Hello there, Commonwealth Realm here. Throughout 35 years, the Legend of Zelda franchise has constantly evolved and changed, something we clearly demonstrated in our previous Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 video. It is just that with every new installment, the Zelda team adds something stupid and completely unnecessary. Rather put, fixing one shortcoming, but adding another one. And believe me, Breath of the Wild was not innocent in this category. Far from it. As such, for a change, instead of talking about what I want to see and think we will see in the sequel to Breath of the Wild, I'm joined by Rebecca, the Forest Minish, to talk about some of the things we absolutely don't want to see in the game. In particular, in a game that will constantly be cross-referenced to the original when it comes out. So be sure to leave a like and subscribe as we are pushing for 300,000 subscribers. Both are completely free to do, and together with the notification bell, we'll let you know when we upload other videos like this one. But now, let's get into what we don't want to see in the sequel.
And we are starting with wasting the potential of Princess Zelda by simply having Ganondorf kidnap her, again. We know this would be a dream come true for anyone who doesn't want Zelda to be playable in any capacity, but throwing away a character that the Zelda team spent most of Breath of the Wild's and all of the DLC memories and cutscenes would just be wrong if you ask us. Zelda has ended up in a damsel role in every Zelda title that she has played a key role except Spirit Tracks, where she was our companion, but Breath of the Wild and its sequel are all about breaking established Zelda conventions. And none of these are more dated and out of touch with the times than the damsel. We cannot stress this enough, but we are tired by the same old take away Princess Zelda so we don't have to develop her more than necessary. Well, Zelda of the Wild is a princess of a kingdom that no longer exists, and a person who despised her role as a divine future monarch, preferring being a scholar instead. Though over the last 100 years she has built plenty of power and even courage on top of wisdom, which makes her the perfect companion for Link in the sequel. And yes, she should be playable in certain sections of the game. If The Witcher 3 could pull it off with a deeply OP royal female character, then Zelda can totally do the same in the sequel to Breath of the Wild.
Next on the list of things we absolutely don't want in Breath of the Wild sequel or future Zelda games is no proper dungeons. One time, okay. Nevertheless, 2 times could mean a new staple for the franchise, and with it a possible end for deeply different dungeons, both in theme and aesthetic like we saw until Breath of the Wild. You know, for 3D Zeldas between 1998 and 2011. This is a path change we believe most of us Zelda fans don't want to stay on. From a narrative and ancient Sheikah technology themed perspective, the Divine Beast made sense in Breath of the Wild. The whole Karikuri mechanical puppet theme and solving one giant puzzle in one chamber was interesting, but would have been even better if it was supplemented by traditional Zelda dungeons, since 4 half dungeons without any door keys and mini-bosses and barely any enemies plus Hyrule Castle isn't exactly what we Zelda veterans are satisfied with. Though this point is actually more than that, as one of the things we absolutely despised was the repetition of dungeon interiors, which literally looked the same but with a different element. If the sequel gives us proper dungeons, but delivers the same identical Zona interiors for all of them, then that will also be a letdown after the amazing dungeons found in all the 3D Zelda games. But then again, there were not more Divine Beasts and traditional dungeons for a reason, since we had 100 plus Sheikah Shrine mini-dungeons. And since we're on the topic, the next thing we don't want to see is...
too many mini-dungeons. 100 plus Sheikah Shrines again under a different name, most likely attached to the so-called Zonai. We will keep this one brief as the point itself is self-explanatory. Breath of the Wild could have dungeons, but didn't because of the Sheikah Shrines, which there were simply too many of. The result of which was that we ended up with a misbalance of dungeon-like structures and mini-dungeons in the game. As much as we love the Sheikah Shrines, we think that the Zelda team needs to balance dungeons and mini-dungeons better, and thus the number of mini-dungeons should be turned down well below 100. And since this was such a brief point, then I might as well do the next one before handing back to Conrad, which is lack of variety in locations, enemies, and bosses. There is no art in creating red, black, silver, and gold enemies where the biggest difference is bigger HP. Yes, we have had color variations for bokoblins in the past, specifically in Skyward Sword, but Breath of the Wild went completely overboard instead of giving us a few more enemy and overworld boss types. The same went with all dungeon locations and shrines having identical interiors. And it definitely didn't have to be that way, since the Trial of the Sword had chambers that were filled with organic areas and which all felt like a breath of fresh air after completing 100 plus cold Sheikah shrines with exactly identical interiors on the path to the ancient Sheikah monks. But there is more that we don't want.
Like bringing back the most hated bits from Breath of the Wild. Naturally, here we have quite a lot to select from, but I want to focus on 3. Too sensitive weapon durability, another pointless collectible that goes beyond 500 in number, and too much rain. Let's begin with weapon durability, which we think could stay as we need incentives to use different types of weapons, but at least make our weapons more durable and possible to repair at a blacksmith or with a potion when they turn red. That should also apply to the Master Sword during combat situations. Then we have the 900 Korok seeds, which I have one thing to say about. Goodbye, you completionist nightmare, and we don't want to see any replacement that has more than 500 to collect across the world. Oh, and when you're at it, please give us a reward that will make collecting the under 500 pieces of something rewarding beyond expanding our inventory slots. Last but not least, in this entry we have the rain, an annoyance that the completionist made an entire song about in his Breath of the Wild review. Obviously, we're not saying that rain should be completely absent in the sequel, but definitely more balanced and not as frequent as it was in the original.
Do you know what we loved about the first 20 hours of Breath of the Wild? The difficulty which constantly kept us on our toes. But then the game became easier and easier and easier. Hence why we don't want the sequel to start as the most difficult 3D Zelda and then make it way too easy the further we advance into the game. AKA what Breath of the Wild did, and which is the opposite of what we see in real life or in an organic experience. The difficulty of the game should be like an exam where the difficulty progresses with us and we face a bigger and bigger gameplay challenge the later we get into the game. Breath of the Wild's difficulty curve started up here and ended up down here. Die, die, die in the beginning and being rather OP when facing Calamity Ganon towards the end. That is the opposite of a true quest where things become more and more difficult the further you get, where through upgrades to your armor, stamina, and health, you are able to adapt to the growing challenge, but don't completely destroy even the strongest of opponents. We want to dread the moment we finally face Ganondorf in the ultimate battle of the franchise. Speaking of which would be a missed opportunity.
Not giving Ganondorf a voice. The lack of personality from the main villain made me feel pretty meh about Calamity Ganon in Breath of the Wild. Like, you're an abomination that needs to be destroyed, but I don't feel anything else about you. Well, Ganondorf needs to be different, and there's no better way to restore Ganondorf's authority than by giving him a deep and menacing voice. If this is his final appearance in the franchise for another 15 plus years, like it was after Twilight Princess, then I want to hear the King of Evil loud and clear. And I want his scenes to be the best part of the story. No good guy Ganondorf, but character building that gives us understanding of his intense hatred apart from being sealed underground for tens of thousands of years. A narration that will send chills down our spines as we finally uncover the most well-guarded secret connecting the past timeline with this new reality of Zelda, with potentially cutscenes from games we know and love but depicted through the Breath of the Wild engine and art style. This speaks for itself. Not giving Ganondorf a voice, and thus taking away this potential journey through the timeline, would be complete and utter waste. Now we have 7 points that tie directly back to some of the things that we wished were different in Breath of the Wild. We want to look to other open world titles that might impact the sequel to Breath of the Wild negatively.
And we begin with 2 examples from Red Dead Redemption 2, as this game has been a source of inspiration for the Zelda team during the development of Breath of the Wild sequel, much like the open world of Skyrim was during the development of Breath of the Wild. Specifically, Red Dead Redemption 2's over-attention on maintenance felt like a chore at times. This ranged from having to eat not to lose health, showering or at least cleaning yourself when getting too dirty, cleaning rifles when they got muddy, and the same went for plenty of other cleaning, crafting, and so on other duties. It definitely added realism, but was it all fun? Not really, as it more often than not felt like work instead of immersing ourselves from our own reality. And just like Reggie once said, if a game isn't fun, then why bother? Breath of the Wild sequel should definitely not be a chore or a horse maintenance simulator, as I jokingly presented in my fake Zelda 35th anniversary direct. But with Red Dead Redemption 2's cleanliness and maintenance mechanics, and this game being a big source of inspiration for the Zelda team, then we may have to say it loud and clear. We don't want unnecessary work in our Zelda adventure.
Though Breath of the Wild should also avoid a different thing that was an issue in a Zelda game of the past. A too dragged out story, aka a game that doesn't know when to end its plot. Red Dead Redemption 2's epilogue transitioned to Red Dead Redemption's starting point and Skyward Sword after the last regular dungeon. No thank you, and no spoilers for both. Breath of the Wild had too little story, but we don't want a dragged out conclusion that lasts 10 hours longer than it has to. This was an off-putting part for many in Red Dead Redemption 2, recently in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and in 2011's Zelda Skyward Sword, which we absolutely don't want to see in this sequel. Especially from a Zelda team that knows that their work will be measured based on the perfect review scores and game awards that they received for Breath of the Wild. A proper story-driven quest is a must in a direct sequel, now that Zelda has been liberated. But don't overextend or add filler, since it is better to have a story of quality throughout than a very lengthy one. This also brings us over to our final point, which is brief, that the story should not be memories, or more specifically cutscenes from the past without any gameplay sequences. My number one wish for Breath of the Wild 2, outside of proper dungeons, is a story and cutscenes that for the most part takes part in the present, focuses on characters of the era of the Wild in the present, lets us play through said story in the present, and which unfolds around us in the present. In Breath of the Wild, we simply felt like the story had already taken place, and what remained was the final act, taking back the divine beasts and defeating Ganon. Hopefully, this big issue that made the story of the past memories disconnected from the present will not be present in the sequel and stand over Breath of the Wild. Something which has in many ways been a theme throughout this video, quality over quantity. That is what Breath of the Wild sequel needs. But what do you think should be absolutely avoided in Breath of the Wild sequel? Other than, Skyward Sword's dowsing, sound off in the comment section down below. A big thanks goes also to Rebecca for joining me in this video, and to all of you who will like this video. If you haven't done that already or pressed that subscribe button, then do so, and also press that notification bell, and again for all notifications to not miss any upcoming Zelda videos. Finally, a shout out to our patreon.com/commonrealm patrons, and in particular to our royal producer Charles Shash. And to all of you, please enjoy one or both of these two awesome videos.